We're in Athens, Georgia on May 29th, 2016, sitting in the Russell...
April
29th, 2016, sitting in the Russell Library. I'm Gary Bertsch, emeritus faculty member of the University of Georgia. I'm sitting here with a good friend, General Gene Habiger. We're going to get into Gene's title and life here in a second, but Gene, I know you've spent some years in Georgia, but I also know that you grew up in California. Can you walk us through some of your early years in California, what brought you to Georgia and how that affected your life?
I'd be more than happy to do that. I was a sophomore at the University of California, pre-med student, not doing well. And one day I had an epiphany that revealed to me that I had to get my act together. So otherwise I was not going to finish college, probably flunk out, and obviously not to get into med school. So I decided to join the Army, and which I did toward the end of my sophomore year. And Army sent me off to Fort Ord, California. And I thought, this is going to be a piece of cake. I'm really going to have a soft time in the Army because I had almost 2 years of college. I was a ham radio operator, could copy Morse code at 30 words a minute, and had good work experience working in a hardware store. I thought, this is a piece of cake. Well, the Army had other ideas. They sent me to advanced infantry training after basic training, and then to Fort Benning, where I was in the infantry there. And while I was there, I had a blind date with a young lady who I later got off and married. And we've been married now for over 53 years. And I was a cultural shock for her parents, who are good Georgia people. She lived in Macon. And they were appalled that their daughter, who was a junior in the pharmacy school, was dating a radical person from California who didn't speak Georgian. And anyway, to make a long story short, it worked out fine, but it was a little tense in the beginning with her parents. So finished up got out of the Army, went back to the University of California, finished my sophomore year, and then transferred back to the University of Georgia, and the rest is history.
How did you then get from the Army to the Air Force, though?
Well, I wanted to fly, and after I got out of the Army, I said to myself, this military life isn't all that bad. Being a private is not necessarily good, but I like the discipline and the structure. So after as I approached my senior year at the University of Georgia, I applied to the Air Force to go to flying school. And that's exactly what happened. I graduated and went to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and through a 90-day commissioning program, was commissioned as second lieutenant in the United States Air Force, and off we went.
How many years in the Air Force, and what were some of your early assignments?
Well, goodness sakes, long time in the Air Force. I got credit for 4 years in the Army, 2 years active and 2 years in the Army Reserve as I finished up college, and then 35 active years in the United States Air Force. And I rose from a second lieutenant to a 4-star general, and I'll tell you, getting up to those higher ranks there's not a whole lot of skill. You just have to be at the right place at the right time when lightning strikes, and that's exactly what happened to me. But I went to, initially I had a minor physical problem and couldn't get into the pilot training, so I went into the intelligence field. And that was a good career move for me because it gave me an appreciation for other things in life other than flying. And probably one of the greatest events in my early military career was the fact that as an intelligence officer, after I got my commission, I was sent to survival school as an instructor. And I taught crew members going to Vietnam how to resist enemy interrogation and how to survive in a prisoner of war camp. Well, then after having done that for 2 years, I got a medical waiver for my minor physical problem, went off to pilot training, and then in 1973, I was tasked by the Air Force to go interview some of the returning POWs to determine how well our training was. And that was one of the most unique experiences of my military career, was to having been in the teaching mode and then talk to these brave young aviators coming back from Vietnam who endured horrible torture and interrogation techniques, and to find out how it went. And that was an incredible experience for me.
We're going to get in depth later your experience with of leadership in the nuclear weapons field and American national security. But were there any events in the early years in the Air Force that led you to Strategic Air Command?
Well, yes. And this is it's going to sound a little bit flip, but it's not. Before I went to pilot training, I saw the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Love the Bomb. And Slim Pickens in that movie, as you recall, when they got the go code to attack the Soviet Union, he went to the safe on board the B-52 and pulled out his 10-gallon cowboy hat. And that, I thought, it was, that's kind of slick. Not that I wore 10-gallon caps, but, that they had that idea, that concept. So I went to pilot training and had my choice of airplanes, and I said, I want to go fly B-52s. And my greatest disappointment when I got into an operational unit was there was no safe on the airplane, no place to put my 10-gallon cap. And it was unique. I'm glad I did that. That was my first assignment out of pilot training, was to a Strategic Air Command base in northern Michigan, Wordsmith, on the shores of Lake Huron. And we got there. It was a cultural shock for my wife and myself, and we had a 3-year-old son at the time. And because cultural shock, because it was cold, it was snowy. Both of us had never been to those climbs, so it was a unique experience for us. And then once I got qualified with the war plan, which took about a month, I was on alert for 7 days at a time in a very heavily guarded compound, sleeping and staying in an underground bunker that was completely self-contained, with probably 80 of my closest crew member friends for 7 days at a time. And we had right outside the bunker on alert pad loaded bombers and loaded tankers, and the bombers were loaded with 4 nuclear weapons, fully fueled, ready to go. And if the klaxon went off, and it normally did at least once, perhaps twice during that 7-day period, anytime during the day or night, our job was to run out to the airplane. And when the klaxon went off, you didn't know if it was an exercise or if it was a real thing. And the first thing you did was get to the airplane, very quickly started your engines, and then turned on the radios, and then you'd get a message from the command post. And it was a coded message, but you could tell by the preamble if it was a real thing or an exercise. And there were three modes. Number one, you started engines and you reported the time that you had all 8 engines running. 8 engines, start all 8 of them in less than a minute. That's quite an achievement. And then the other exercise was you would taxi to the runway. And then the third option was you'd taxi the runway and then taxi down the runway. And so each crew was graded on how well they did that, what kind of times they maintained, and it was a unique experience. I did that for 4 years, going on alert on a regular basis. A typical schedule for me was to go on alert on a Friday, get off alert 7 days later on the following Friday, go home, have Saturday, Sunday, Monday off. Then while we were on alert, we'd mission plan for a training mission, and we'd fly on Tuesday, come back, mission plan on Wednesday, fly on Thursday, and go back alert again on Friday. And that got kind of old after a while. That's all you were doing was on alert, mission planning, or flying. And then to top it off, at that time we were flying airborne alert, 24 hours with a fully armed airplane over the North Pole. And those were unique missions. And I volunteered for everyone I could get, in addition to the one that my regular crew flew, because in order to upgrade from a co-pilot to an aircraft commander, you had to have a minimum number of hours. Well, the only way you get a minimum number of hours quickly was to volunteer for these 24-hour alert missions. So my wife thought I was absolutely insane because I'd get off alert on a Friday and go fly on Saturday for 24 hours, have Sunday off, Monday off, and then go fly again on Tuesday. She thought that was a little crazy.
Well, somehow all of this brings you later to become U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Strategic Air Command. But I know before there were some stops in the Pentagon and elsewhere. What are some of your recollections from what was happening in terms of international security policy, U.S. national security policy, and what did you do in the Pentagon and some of the other places that you stopped?
Well, that's a good question. I had 3 tours in the Pentagon. One as a colonel, as the head of the Strategic Forces Division in Plans. And we developed the policies for the upcoming B-1 bomber that, as you recall, was canceled by President Carter and then reinstated by President Reagan. And we defended that program. A lot of criticism about the program and the cost, because there were certain politicians who saw that the Cold War was coming to an end, and they questioned the utility and practicality of buying a new bomber. So we initially were going to buy, I think as I recall, about almost 200 of the B-1 bomber. And because of political pressures, we brought that number down to 144, and then eventually ended up buying 100 bombers. And that's how many we have on active duty today. They're no longer nuclear capable bombers. And it's a long story behind that in terms of why it's they're no longer nuclear in a nuclear war plan. But that first encounter as a colonel in the Pentagon showed me how decisive politics are in terms of what happens in the military, in terms of driving force levels, and in terms of the force structure of our U.S. military, not just the Air Force, but the Army, Navy, and the Marine Corps. And so that was my first encounter in the Pentagon. And my second encounter was as a 2-star, 1 and 2-star general, when I was a programmer for the Air Force. We developed the programs that we would recommend to the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force as to how the Air Force would spend its resources, allocate its resources, for the next 5 years. Something called the POM, the Program Objective Memorandum. It's different from the budget. The budget is a year look out how we're going to spend our money, and budgeteers took care of that. And the programmers looked at the long-term strategy of how we were going to allocate our resources. And I did that beginning in 1987 through 1991. And that's when we saw the development of the concept of the peace dividend. The Cold War was ending. And that was a radical transformation. If you think about it, the Cold War was one of the longest wars, the longest war in modern times that the United States had ever fought. And we won. And I'll get back to the winning part later. But we had to downsize from that. And people on the Hill in Congress were looking for a peace dividend. You know, how can we save lots of money by doing some dramatic things? And that was a painful transition for those of us in the military, because politicians wanted a return on their investment very quickly, and the B-1 bomber was a classic example of that, reducing the buy dramatically down to 100 airplanes. And the base closures was another. I was right in the middle of the BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. And that was an interesting phenomenon that really hasn't been captured by many in terms of after World War II's dramatic shutting down of military bases all over the United States. And then in the early 60s, as we began to have a little different view of the Cold War, we didn't have to ramp up with as many different facilities as we thought we were going to have to ramp up to. There was a series of base reductions during the early 60s. And then things were in a state of being dormant until 1988, when the Carlucci Commission came up with the first significant reduction of military bases. And this is unique, and hopefully some enterprising students will do a work on this, and that is Carlucci Commission didn't have the congressional oversight or the laws that mandated very, very strict solutions or very strict protocols for the closures of bases, because all of a sudden it dawned on the politicians that, hey, when you start closing bases, you impact my rice bowls back home. You know, my constituents are not going to be happy with having a base that had been there forever to be shut down. Well, the United States government, politicians, and the citizens of the United States had become very accustomed to having military bases in their backyard. Jobs, construction jobs, personnel, military people spending millions of dollars in their community. And so their hue and cry was, no, you can't do that. This base has been here forever. Well, if you go back and look in the history, the base had probably been there since World War II. And there was no legacy for the base to continue operating. So it became very painful. So Congress enacted the series of legislation that made it very, very difficult for the military to close bases. It had certain criteria. If you exceeded the criteria with personnel or size of facilities, you had to get congressional approval. Well, that restricted significantly what kind of a free hand that Department of Defense could play. As a matter of fact, there was no free hand anymore. And you had the BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission of 1991, which I was very much a part of, then 1993, and then 1995. And at the end of that process, we closed several bases around the country, from all services. And a couple lessons learned. Number one, the people around the bases didn't like this at all. You know, you could not logically argue with them that the base is no longer viable. The Cold War was over. We won the Cold War. And again, I'll get back to the winning of the Cold War a little bit later on. But it was very, very painful but necessary. But we weren't able to get down to the levels of facilities that we needed to. And the next round of base closures occurred in 2005. And the Department of Defense and military services have made many arguments that we need more base closures. There's been estimates that we have over 20% excess capacity. But Congress doesn't want to hear that, because if they agree to another round of base closures, they're slitting their throats in terms of being reelected. So it's very painful and very expensive. And the other thing about the base closure exercise was the fact that the environmental laws in the United States are rather restrictive, and for good reason. But the remediation of military bases to meet environmental standards was such that it became very expensive to close bases. In other words, you didn't get a return on your investment for closing the base for many years in the future. But now that we've gone through Carlucci, 91, 93, 95, and 2005, 5 rounds of base closures, we've learned a lot of lessons. We have saved a lot of money. And Congress has responded with no more base closures on our watch. And the other thing they've come up with to kind of mitigate how we're going to save money here is the idea of joint bases. In other words, instead of having an Air Force base at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland and Bolling Air Force Base in District of Columbia, you would have now joint base Bolling, joint base Andrews, and they'd consolidate some of the infrastructure to manage those bases. And Congress said, that's how we're going to save money. Well, I'm very skeptical that we're going to save much money there. So let me get back to the idea of the Cold War. The longest war we've ever fought in modern times. We clearly won, but the loser really didn't lose. In 1991, when the Berlin Wall came down, or before then, but when, Gorbachev, accepted the fact that the Soviet Union was no longer the Soviet Union. In virtually every other major war we fought, the loser paid a very high price. Disarmament, giving up hardware, concessions, financial liabilities. Well, none of that happened when the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union became Russia, and they were able to keep their nuclear forces at the levels they had before. There were some reductions, and significant reductions. But if they had really lost, and we'd been very aggressive, I think we'd be in a different place today with nuclear arms, because the Russians were very, very reluctant to give up their nuclear forces, because the nuclear weapon part of their structure allowed them to be truly a superpower. But I think if we played hardball with them in the early 90s, it would have turned out a lot differently in terms of where we are today.
And do you think we should have played hardball with them?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. A lot of smart people, a lot smarter and sharper than I, were in political leadership positions in the White House and on the Hill. But I think that was an opportunity lost.
And how might it have changed things?
Oh, we wouldn't have gone through the reduction of nuclear forces. When when in the mid-90s we were both down to about 3,000 nuclear weapons. Now we're down to about 1,500. And that's the right thing. We're on the right glide path to get down to lower levels of nuclear weapons. But I think we could have taken a bold step in the early part of that decade to get the former Soviet Union down to perhaps even zero.
So are you thinking that bold steps should have been taken on both sides, or the way you came at this, I thought maybe you were feeling that the United States should have demanded and forced a conclusion, agreement with Russia that would have taken most or all of their nuclear weapons away.
Absolutely. That's the scenario I would have envisioned, was the victor looks the loser in the eye and says, this is what you're going to do. And we didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. And how would that affected U.S. nuclear force levels?
Well, we would have gone down to lower levels for sure. And we've been on a glide path that most people feel very comfortable with in terms of getting down to lower and lower levels of nuclear weapons. But it's taken us, think about this. The Cold War has been over for 25 years. And we're still mucking around with nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And it's an entirely different, the world's a lot safer place, don't get me wrong. But today, during the Cold War, nuclear weapons in the United States deterred Soviet nuclear weapons. Today, the Russians are no longer our enemy. And the Chinese, really, if you look at the economic ties we have with them and the political ties, are no longer our enemy. So nuclear weapons today, in my view, and I feel very strongly about this, no longer deter nation states, they deter other nuclear weapons. Hmm. And a subset of that is terrorism. Terrorist organizations around the world have publicly announced that they would like to explode a nuclear weapon or device, and big difference between a device and a weapon. A terrorist group, if they could get their hands on highly enriched uranium, it doesn't take much, or plutonium, they could build a nuclear device. And a nuclear device may not get much in terms of yield, would probably be very, very inefficient relative to nuclear weapons that are in the inventories of many nations around the world today. But you want to kill 2 or 3 million people in lower Manhattan, you put a nuclear device, you get the plutonium or highly enriched uranium, you put it in a Connex container, and you ship it to lower Manhattan. And you put it in a Connex container which doesn't have the vibration or the G loading or the altitude or temperature variations that a nuclear weapon has to go through. And you don't have to have a sophisticated device to trigger the weapon. You just ship this Connex container lower Manhattan and you set it off with a cell phone. Professor Bertsch, there are 30,000 Connex containers that enter the United States every day. Hmm. And only a very, very small percentage are thoroughly inspected.
General Habiger, I want to get into the work that you've been involved with Senator Sam Nunn and Ted Turner and others through the Nuclear Threat Initiative. You've been involved over a decade, and talk about that and current challenges. But before we go there, let's talk about your years of leadership as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Strategic Command. How did that come about?
Well, again, it's being in the right place at the right time. At that time, the commanders-in-chiefs of the various combatant commands were selected for 2-year terms. And let me back up for a second, just to put things in perspective. The commander of Strategic Command today is no longer a commander-in-chief. He is a commander of United States Strategic Command. And why is that? Because we had a Secretary of Defense named Rumsfeld who claimed that only one person was a commander-in-chief, and that was the President of the United States. So he unilaterally erased all the commander-in-chief designations. But I was a commander-in-chief. I'm very proud of that. And I will not give up that title, even though I'm retired. But there was, you were nominated as a potential commander-in-chief by the Secretary of Defense, and in this case it was Bill Perry, to the President of the United States, who after his staff, after a great deal of vetting, forwarded your name, if that was the name they wanted, to the Senate for confirmation. And then the Senate would, in committee, talk about the individual and then send the name to the floor and for confirmation. So that's how I was selected in 1995. I was in the Pentagon as the person in charge of personnel. And a little vignette on that, I was selected by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time, General Ron Fogelman, to be the Chief of Personnel. And he called me and he said, "Gene, I want you to come up here and be Chief of Personnel." I said, "Chief, I don't even know how to spell personnel." He said, "That's not the point. You're going to come up here and do that." So I went up there in March of 1994, and we got my third star and became the commander or the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like being Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Strategic Air Command?
It was humbling, and it was a little bit terrifying, knowing that during this time frame, there was the Cold War was over, so you really didn't worry too much about a bolt out of the blue from Russia, but we had direct contact with the President of the United States, and he had the military aide walking around with the football you've heard so much about. And in the event of a nuclear attack, a surprise nuclear attack, there'd be a conference call between the commander of our Air Defense Command, Space Command, Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Command, Secretary of Defense, and the President of the United States. And the idea was that the Commander-in-Chief of Space Command would give his assessment as to the indications of an attack on the United States. And then he would make a recommendation that his assessment, whether it was real or perhaps we could wait a little bit. And after he gave that assessment, I would make recommendations to the President of the United States. He, in the football, had a book. I can't get into a lot of detail, but the book was like a lot of pictures and not much in the way of verbiage, but you could walk through the various tabs depending on the quality of the attack that we perceived coming, and make recommendations on the response that the United States would make. Again, response, not first strike, but we were responding to an attack by Russia. And you only had a few minutes to do this. And so, there wasn't a whole lot of chit-chat, and it was, we practiced it in exercises, never with the president, but surrogates that played the role of president. And if you look back on the advent of nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare, Jimmy Carter was the only president that showed any interest in any level of detail on responding to a Soviet attack for a lot of good political reasons. And we exercised at much lower levels these kind of scenarios on a regular basis, 3 or 4 times a year. So you would feel comfortable with what the communication links were and what was going to be said over these phones. And the other thing that, what we talked about earlier, the bombers and the tankers being on alert, being able to get off the ground in less than 15 minutes. Well, until I believe it was 1991 or early 1992, we had what we call looking glass airplanes, airborne command and control airplanes, lots of communications on board. They could be air refueled, and we had an airplane airborne 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter what the weather was, what was going on. And there was always a general officer on board the airplane. And as a 1-2 star at the SAC, as the Inspector General, and as the Commander-in-Chief, I would fly my fair share of looking glass sorties. And again, it was 8 hours. Missions were 8 hours in length. And there was a bunk, a place where the general could sleep if he was so inclined, if it was an all-nighter. Because if you took off at 11 o'clock at night and you landed at 7 in the morning, you were expected to go to work. You didn't go home and take a combat nap. You went to work until 5 or 6 that afternoon. So that went on for, oh goodness, probably 30 years we did that.
Gene, just tell us quickly how the term football came to represent this and just basically what it was.
Well, it was, labeled the football. What it was a black briefcase, a fat black briefcase. That wasn't terribly heavy, but it had to have this book that I was telling you about. And that followed the president around wherever he went. And there were also other black footballs around. And the apostolic succession, there's only one person in the United States during the Cold War, or even today, that can release a nuclear weapon. The President of the United States is number one. If he's not accessible or incapacitated, as Reagan was during his assassination attempt, it's given because of an amendment to or a law that it goes to the vice president. And during Reagan's assassination attempt, it went to the vice president. And then after him, it's the Speaker of the House. So that's number 3. And number 4, and this was, I'm giving this vignette because it was it's significant to me. The number 4 person is the President pro tem of the Senate. And during my tenure at Strategic Command, it was Strom Thurmond. And I have a great deal of respect for Strom Thurmond. Great American, great politician. But I'll tell you, in his later years, he was starting to lose it a little bit. And I could just see Gene Habiger at 2 in the morning talking to Senator Thurmond for a variety of reasons. It would take quite a bit for it to get down to him, but to try to talk Strom Thurmond through the attack options with only 3 minutes to go, daunting at best. And I got to pay a courtesy call on Senator Thurmond 2 or 3 times a year, and toward the end, my apprehension grew. And the other thing that was interesting is that the laws specifically state the apostolic succession in terms of what cabinet members after the President pro tem would have release authority for nuclear weapons or to take over the government if something were to happen. Well, I was at Strategic Command, I guess, in about 97, and I had a young non-commissioned officer come in and say, "General, we've got a problem. We just got the new list of people who could release nuclear weapons out of Washington, and Albright, Secretary of State Albright, is on the list, as she should have been. But he said, there's a problem. She can't play the role of president or assume the role of president because she's not a U.S. citizen. So we're going to have to take her name off the list. Well, Madeleine Albright was not happy about that we did that. But, the people at Strategic Command were good. They were efficient. And that was just one example of how attention to detail played such a role in our deterrent posture against the former Soviet Union.
General Habiger, over the years, there has been much discussion through the current day about how many nuclear weapons the United States needs to protect American national security. When you were Commander-in-Chief, how did you feel about the numbers?
Oh, we had too many. I felt very strongly about that. As a matter of fact, when I met my Russian counterpart, then three-star General Sergeyev, I expressed concern. He expressed concern. He went off to be the Minister of Defense, becoming a marshal, and he was succeeded by General Yakovlev, who I got to know very well. And he shared the same concern. Now, this is not, we're not going to go out and publicly articulate something that's against our civilian leadership. The Russians, as well as the United States military people, are professionals. They understand that they are subservient to the civilian leadership in their respective governments. And I did not go out and while I was on active duty, or as the SINC, the Commander-in-Chief, and articulate a case off the top of my head. What we did, though, is when we went from Start 2, which got us down to 3,500, down to Start 3, which was 2,000 or so, 2,500, to go to that next increment, it took a little bit of innovation to get down those levels, because the Iron Majors, as we call them, the young officers in the trenches that make all this stuff happen, they generally have some pretty firm ideas on what has to be. And so I had to personally go through all of the Russian targets that we had in our Start 3 or Start 2 protocols to get us down to a lower level. And that was painful in terms of what targets are we going to take out of the target base. And, it was, for me, it was easy because, the way the nuclear war plan was built at that time, it's no longer made this way, but it was a very structured approach. You'd have the president at some point early in his administration develop a presidential decision directive, which was top secret, no more than 5 or 6 pages, and would articulate in very general terms how the United States strategic forces would be employed to deter the Soviet Union or to attack if attacked. That document was sent to the Office of Secretary of Defense, and they added another several layers of detail on top of that, and developed something called the weapons system, or the nuclear weapons system plan. And that was then sent to the Joint Staff, part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They would add another level of detail, something called the Unified Command Plan, and then that was sent to Strategic Air Command, or to STRATCOM. And then we would develop how many weapons we'd need and how we'd employ those weapons based upon those plans. And let me back up and say that the Office of Secretary of Defense, the plan they developed was a Nuclear Weapons Employment Plan, the NUEP as we called it. And then the SAC, or STRATCOM, would develop something called the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. And that was a unique plan in that you had a war plan down to a very high level of detail that showed where each weapon that you were going to employ, where it was going to go. There's no other plan in the history of our military that was that detailed. You know, you'd allocate so many divisions, so many thousands of rounds of ammunition, so many gallons of fuel to the theater commander, and then he, depending on what was happening on the battlefield, would allocate those resources. The PSYOP was just ready to go. It wasn't even on the shelf. It was all loaded into the weapon systems, the bombers, the missiles, and a ballistic missile, submarine ballistic missiles. So you could be ready to go at an instant moment, and there was no planning involved after the fact. It was already done. So that was the structure we used to develop what our requirements would be. Well, you get a lot of guidance, and getting back to the point about how we got down to the lower levels of 2,000, 2,500, is that, for example, I looked at the guidance said that, the guidance I'm talking about, probably the guidance that came out of the Joint Staff, because out of OSD and out of the President was very general, but the guidance out of the Joint Staff said that you would neutralize all airfields capable of handling Russian long-range bombers. Well, you know, the planners, the Iron Majors, would look at the data in the intelligence base and say, there are, 150 bases capable of handling long-range Russian Soviet bombers. Well, they only had 70 bombers. So why go out and put 2 or 3 or 4 nuclear weapons on 150 or so airfields when you knew in your heart of hearts that they weren't going to use these bases? There were, problems with fuel capacity and other instrument landing protocols. So that's the kind of thing I did in terms of coming down to lower levels. And there was another aspect of this that I would never be able to do that today, because the nuclear weapons policy, defense policy, has become so politicized that I would have had to have gotten approval from people on the Hill. And so what I did was very quietly took the revised numbers for Start 3 on a little road show, just myself and my aide. We went out and I talked to various people, former commanders-in-chief, and folks, policymakers here in the Washington area, and briefed them on how we were going to get down to from 3,000, 3,500 down to 2,000, 2,500, and gave them the protocols and the methodologies, and I all got a head nod from all of them. Wouldn't have happened today. Would have required a lot, State Department getting involved and that sort of thing.
Gene, I know during your years as commander, you opened some unprecedented communication with the Russian counterparts, and I remember seeing on 60 Minutes and elsewhere some coverage of your efforts. Can you tell us a little bit about reaching out to the Russians, why you did it, and what happened?
Sure. Well, I saw an opportunity here because 1995, 1996, the Cold War had been over for 5 or 6 years. It was time to start developing a relationship with our Russian counterparts. So my first encounter was with General Sergeyev. We met just before a meeting with our bosses meeting in Moscow. The Ministers of Defense, Bill Perry was the Minister of Defense, or our Secretary of Defense at the time. And we really hit it off. We met in a room with his interpreter and my interpreter, and we just It really worked out well. Well, I saw an opening, so first of all, we became so enthused with our discussion that we let the time go by. We didn't have the aides in there to keep us on track. We had interpreters. And so we looked at our watches and we're 20 minutes late to the meeting that our bosses were going to be sitting in with lots of other high-ranking defense and State Department, Minister of Foreign Affairs people. So we both looked at each other and said, it's time to go. So we got out of our chairs, walked across the street to where the meeting was going to take place. And luckily, the principals had not arrived yet. So just about the time we got to our seats, the big guys showed up. And we looked at each other saying, boy, we missed the bullet on this one. And so I invited Sergeyev to come to my headquarters at Offutt. And he agreed, came with some of his staff, and we hit it off very, very well. And I took him around, showed him things that were never shown before, took him into a nuclear weapons storage site in Wyoming, showed him nuclear warheads, never been done before. And I didn't ask for permission. I just said, let's do this. And my staff saying, boss, you need to be careful about this. I said, not to worry, we got this made. So I went up there about a month or two before Sergeyev was to come on just a normal visit. And so being my penchant for detail, I said, let's go into the nuclear weapons storage area and show me how you're going to have the weapons laid out. And Sergeyev had a real issue with his political minders in Russia, because part of the protocol, the new arms control protocol, is that we'd have, and they would not have, any multiple reentry vehicles, multiple independent target reentry vehicles. They'd just be single warhead missiles. That subsequently has gone away, but I showed Sergeyev how I had a warhead, Minuteman warhead with the old missile head on with 3 warheads on it, and then I showed him the new one with just a single warhead. And I had a non-commissioned officer up on a stand with him and an interpreter, and walked him through the mechanics and that sort of thing. And as he got down, through an interpreter, he couldn't speak English. He said, Gene, you can't imagine how much good this has done, because now I can go back to my political people in Moscow and tell them this is not a problem. The political people were concerned that we'd go ahead and put the new bulkhead in place, but we could immediately go from 1 warhead back to 3. And we showed him in no uncertain terms that could not be done. So you can't imagine how much good this has been. And then getting back to the precursor visit. Normally, when I went into a facility like that, they would streamline the security precautions because they knew it was me. They knew I wasn't going to walk in there with a bomb, and so they'd streamline the security procedures for entry. So we were talking about Sergeyev coming, and the chief of security for this particular base said, "Okay, boss, we'll do the same thing with your Russian general when he comes." I said, "No, you're going to go through the same strict protocols as if it was Joe Sixpack coming in." And they couldn't quite understand it. I said, "You need to understand, I want him to know, to see firsthand how strict our security procedures are." They understood that. So, we drove up to the facility, we got out, had the wand, got Sergeyev, they got me, we walked in, had to show them our ID cards. And, no corners were cut. This was strictly on the up and up. Well, anyway, this was on let's say a Tuesday. I finished up with him on, say, Thursday. And I want to point out, because this is a great historical vignette, is that we discovered, and I can't tell you how we discovered that Sergeyev was a big fan of Chicago Bulls. I mean, big fan. And whenever he could watch it on satellite TV, he'd watch the Chicago Bull football game or basketball games. So I had my chief of staff, a very talented young man named Early Callender, a colonel. I said, get up to Michael Jordan's staff and see if we can get a basketball signed by Michael Jordan. Okay? This was about a month out. And so, sure enough, 10 days later, a basketball shows up. General Sergeyev, best wishes, Michael Jordan. And then we built a walnut case, glass. And so the last night that Sergeyev was in the United States at my base at Omaha, Offutt, we had a farewell dinner for him. He and his staff, my staff, there were about 20 people there. And as the evening was winding down, I said, my friend, I have a special gift for you. And so on a table, we had this stand covered with a cloth. And I said, this is for you. And tears came to his eyes. First of all, he could not believe we had that intelligence on him. And number two, that we were able to get Michael Jordan to sign a autograph and a personalized autograph of a basketball. So anyway, that was an interesting vignette. And this was, say, on a Thursday. Well, Friday, I called my boss. By this time, it was Bill Cohen, the Secretary of Defense. I said, Mr. Secretary, let me tell you what I did. I took a Russian into our nuclear weapons storage area at Francis C. Warren, and I showed him nuclear warheads, and I wanted to show him the protocols for not going with multiple independent reentry vehicles. And there was a pause at the other end. I didn't know if it was going to be fired or what was going to happen. And Secretary Cohen said, Gene, good move.
Has that kind of communication carried on through what happened?
I think it's a matter of it's personality dependent. To be able to reach out to these folks and to when Sergeyev went up to become Minister of Defense and his replacement was General Yakovlev, he and I hit it off the same way. I had Yakovlev come over and I told him to bring his chief of bombers with him, which he did. And I had the bomber guy go to Barksdale Air Force Base. And he had with him his chief navigator in the bomber command. And we threw him on a B-52 and flew him on a sortie that air refueled and put him in the seat, low level, and let him simulate dropping of a bomb. And he thought that was just slick. And then when Yakovlev came over on the same trip, took him to F.E. Warren again to show him what one of our missiles units were. And in Russia, the Soviet Union and Russia, the nuclear forces are broken down into the missile forces, the submarine ballistic missile forces, and the bombers. Okay, 3 different people getting guidance 3 different ways from the general staff. Well, I knew that, and that's why I asked him to bring his bomber guy, or not his bomber guy, but the bomber guy, so I could see how the bombers operated. And there wasn't much in the terms of communication between the missile guys, the bomber guys, and the submarine guys in Russia. So I took Yakovlev to Bangor, Washington, to our ballistic missile submarine base up there, and took on a submarine, showed him where the Navy stored their nuclear warheads in Bangor, Washington. And again, things that had never been shown to Russians before.
And what was the objective of opening up to the Russians this way? And was it reciprocal? Did you go over there?
Yeah, yes, it was. And it served two purposes. Number one, during the mid-90s, there was a lot of media attention based primarily on a retired Russian army general who came to Washington once a year and went before congressional committees and talked about suitcase bombs, that there were loose nukes in Russia. Security was very lax. And the Russians didn't like that at all because they had another view. And I knew that was a problem for them. And we just hadn't communicated with each other about these kinds of things. To make a long story short, the Russians were eager for me to see their nuclear security. So I went to a bomber base, 3 missile bases, and a submarine base and saw how they guarded their nuclear weapons. And then I was able to come back and had a press conference in Washington about, in my view, from what I saw, and I also went to a national nuclear weapons storage site. So I went to 4 different kinds of sites, and I got to see what non-Luger monies were doing in terms of applying technology, because the Russians were doing things in a very manpower-intensive way and not really applying technology. So I got to see what they were doing, how they were doing it, and then came back in this press conference, which you can read online, and pretty much assured the Congress and the American public that the Russians were deadly serious about nuclear weapons security. And the other, so there was, they wanted me to see that side. And they also saw that when I opened up my facilities, that they can open up their facilities to me. And I was the first non-Russian, non-Soviet to ever go into a military nuclear weapons storage site and see a nuclear weapon, a Russian nuclear weapon. Never been done before. And what I discovered on this trip was that, you know, through different stovepipes in the United States and in the Soviet Union and Russia, there were some rather severe protocols, strict protocols, for ensuring that we didn't have someone deranged around nuclear weapons. In the United States, it's something called the Personnel Reliability Program. And I won't go into any detail, but a lot of details about if an individual is having marital problems and it appears to be affecting him, he doesn't pull nuclear duty, either in the maintenance arena or in the operational arena. And that's what the Personnel Reliability Program did. In Russia, I discovered they, you know, on their own, had a different series of protocols. Before they went on alert, either as a security person or an operator or a maintenance guy, they had to have an interview with a psychologist. And if they were on specific kinds of medications, they couldn't pull alert. The same kinds of things we did. So there was a lot of openings there that gave us insights that we never had before. Mm-hmm. And it was easy. It was just a matter of developing confidence and trust. And both Sergeyev and I and Yakovlev and I were very candid with each other and very open, and we were able to exchange a lot of information just one-on-one. Yakovlev and I would go on long walks in his headquarters base, which is about 30 kilometers outside of Moscow, and walk in the forest there in its base and just talk about things. And this is where we talked about levels of nuclear weapons being too high and both sides needed to get down. I think he was more motivated by the cost, because during the mid-90s, Russian economy was flat on its back. Matter of fact, as I went on to Yakovlev's headquarters base, Barbara and I were in the car together, and we had a Russian colonel, I think, with us and an interpreter, and there were hundreds of men out in military uniforms in a potato field harvesting potatoes by hand. I said, "What are they doing?" He says, "They're harvesting potatoes." And that kind of gives you some idea of the economic straits that we're in.
Gene, let's take a short break, and then I'd like to talk about some of the more recent things you've been involved in.
Okay, good.
Okay, General Habiger, we're back from a break, and we left off with some of your experiences and observations during your leadership of the Strategic Air Command. Did you retire after that assignment?
No. I spent about a year decompressing, traveling a little bit with my wife, and trying to figure out how we were going to take all the stuff that we had in our home in Offutt Air Force Base, about almost 7,000 square feet, to fit into a 2,600 square foot home in San Antonio, Texas. And about a year after we got down to San Antonio, after I retired from the military, I got a call from the Secretary of Energy. I was in Moscow at the time. And Secretary Richardson called and said, "General Habiger, you don't know me, but I have a problem here at Department of Energy, and I need you to come be my security czar and get all these rabid dogs off my case." So I said, "Mr. Secretary, I'd be more than happy to talk to you." So he said, "When you get back to the United States, come to Washington and let's talk." So I did, and he explained that he was undergoing a great deal of pressure because of the Wen-Ho Lee case. Wen-Ho Lee is the Chinese nuclear physicist who stole the test data for all 1,054 U.S. nuclear tests. And they put it on a cassette, which you can't use anymore because it's old technology. And it was a great political firestorm in Washington, D.C. about Department of Energy and what they were doing and how they could survive. So I agreed to come on board as Secretary of Energy's security czar, and it was I call that my period of indentured servitude. I got an apartment over in Crystal City, and went home 3 weekends out of every 4, which was very painful, only because I'd get home in San Antonio about 11 o'clock at night and then have to leave about 3 or 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon in order to get back to Washington to go to work Monday morning. And I did that for almost a year and a half, and I'd like to think I did some good for the Department of Energy. But I will tell you, Professor Bertsch, that this was a period of intense political infighting between the Republican Congress and the Democratic White House. And I have no political dogs in this hunt or any other hunt, but it became very acrimonious, and I was right in the middle of it. And it was not fun. But we survived. We got over it. There was one individual, and you won't read this in books anywhere, that changed the entire makeup of Department of Energy. A senator from New Mexico. His name is Pete Domenici. Senator Domenici had a real problem with Department of Energy. I don't know why, but his claim to fame was that there are no clear-cut lines of accountability or authority or responsibility, So he was going to break off the nuclear weapons part of the Department of Energy off into something called the National Nuclear Security Agency, and NNSA. And that just cut me off the knees because I was working security for the whole department, and now security for the nuclear weapons, which was the vast majority of what needed to be done, was put off into another agency. So the secretary really had no control over security in the nuclear weapons laboratories. I saw the magnitude of the problem from two perspectives. Number one, I was in the job for a matter of days, and I asked the financial people that worked for me, I said, how much money are we spending on security? And it's the Department of Energy. And the answer I got back was, we don't know. What do you mean we don't know? Well, because security is put in overhead accounts that we don't have visibility on at the nuclear weapons laboratories. I said, you got to be kidding me. No, that's where we operate. And so after squeezing a lot of people, I discovered we were spending about $1 billion a year. And that astounded lots of people that were spending that much money. And the other thing I discovered as I got out and got a feel in the first month, I went around, traveled all over the country and went to virtually every one of the 13 or so nuclear laboratories, not weapons laboratories, but nuclear laboratories, and discovered that this was a mess. That and I came back and I told the secretary, I said, you've got essentially 13 tribes of Indians out there. They all speak different language. They all make their teepees differently. They all have different war paint, and they're not even close to being part of a cohesive organization, and that struck Richardson by surprise. But that's exactly what was going on out there, and there was one former Secretary of Energy who allegedly said at his farewell luncheon, and he'd been Secretary of Energy for almost 3 years. It was just recently, he said, I discovered that, Navy Admiral now, that the steering wheel is not connected to the rudder. And so that kind of, and I agree with that 100%. It was a very dysfunctional organization. But I think what Domenici did was not good for the organization.
Interesting. It wasn't long after, it seems to me, that I recall you got a call from a man by the name of Ted Turner to talk about the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Can you tell us about that experience?
Well, yes. I was still Secretary of Energy, working for him. And Ted called me. He was down in Atlanta, still owned America Online or CNN. Not America Online, but CNN. And I flew down and met with him, had lunch with him, and he had recently viewed my interview with Dan Rather on 60 Minutes too. And he made it clear to me that he found the interview to be compelling, and he liked what I had to say. And I thanked him for that. And he said, I'm going to start up something, he didn't know what it would be, to reduce the levels of nuclear weapons in the world. And he said, I want you to be a part of that as I set up this organization. Well, within 6 months or so, he set up the Nuclear Threat Initiative. He brought in Sam Nunn to be the co-chair and also the president. And we things went from there. Now, when we first started off in 2000, it was going to be, and it still is, the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Well, during that, just after we stood up,
you said 2000, it was 2010, wasn't it?
No, 2001.
Oh, that's right.
2000. The idea was to set up an organization that reduced the level of nuclear weapons. Now, about the time we were standing the organization up, other threats developed. We had the anthrax scare with 9/11. We had terrorist threats, biological threats. So we talked a lot about maybe changing our name. And the consensus was, no, we need to stick with Nuclear Threat Initiative. And that's what we did. And Sam or Ted set this up. And at the time, Turner assumed he was going to have about $250 million that he'd be able to use of his own personal wealth to set up NTI. Well, when he sold CNN and America Online came around, his wealth plummeted dramatically. And he didn't have that kind of money. So we had to cut back dramatically our expectations, our long-range goals. But it's still a viable organization. It's been around for 15, 16 years now. And we have a staff in Washington, D.C. And we're making a difference in terms of getting people to talk to each other, getting our arms around nuclear materials. As I pointed out earlier, what stands between nuclear terrorism and where we are today is the difficulty in people getting their hands on highly enriched uranium or plutonium. And we've had a major impact on accounting for that. We've done some very innovative things with medical alerting systems in the Middle East as various viruses show up to ensure the health departments in all the countries in the Middle East are made aware. Heightened levels of security. We have former Minister of Foreign Affairs from Russia on our board, the father of the H-bomb in China on our board, member of the World Court, arms inspector for Iraq. So we've got a good, diverse, and we've got a Middle East representation. And so we've got good representation from around the world of parties who are concerned about nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. That's always been a big issue for us.
I also understand in 2004 you got a call from your alma mater, the University of Georgia, to come down and take a look at some of their programs and help out.
Well, the timing was impeccable. At that time, between 2001 and 2004, I was the president and CEO of the San Antonio Water Company and responsible for the water and wastewater activities of the 9th largest city in the United States. And that was a good job. I enjoyed it. It was fun. The company had been run by engineers up to that point, and they were having some leadership challenges. So I went out and just using my leadership experience from the military, got morale up and productivity up, and things were going well. And about the time I was ready to retire from that, I was told to fix it. I fixed it in early 2004. I got a call from this guy, Gary Bertsch, at the Center for International Trade and Security, asking if I'd be interested to come back to Georgia and become a member of the Center for International Trade and Security. And he said, oh, by the way, it would be really good for us if you and your wife move back here. Well, that caused a lot of consternation in the Habiger household because 23 moves in 35 years, and I'd had enough of moving. So Barbara and I talked it over long and hard and decided that we'd come back here and see what Professor Bertsch had to offer. So we flew back, And this organization, Center for International Trade and Security, really had it down pat. We landed at Hartsfield International Airport on a Delta flight, and we got off the airplane, and standing there at the gate bridgeway was a member of the CITS, Center for International Trade and Security staff, and said, "General, Ms. Habiger, down these steps." So we didn't even go through the terminal. We went down the steps and jumped into a Georgia State Patrol car. I thought, wow, this is pretty impressive. And then they drove us across, and they said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of your bags." And they drove us across the tarmac to a parking lot, and we got into a very large sedan, and we were driven to Athens. And I said to Barbara, I said, "Hey, this is kind of slick. This Center for International Trade and Security has got their act together." Well, we were wined and dined by you, Gary, and your staff. And at the end of the wining and dining, we decided that becoming a part of the CITS staff was the right thing for us to do, and that's what we did.
I also know that you're on the board of advisors of this board of visitors of the School of Public and International Affairs. What does that work involve?
Well, I was asked by then Dean Tom Loth to become a member of the board of visitors. And that has been a very exciting and inspirational chore. It's pro bono, which is fine, and we meet twice a year, and we look at what's going on in the School for Public and International Affairs. And I found that to be very rewarding. It's doesn't consume a lot of time. I still do a lot of work for Harvard. I'm part of a group called the ELBA group, ELBE, Elba River, World War II, the meeting of the U.S. Army and Soviet Army troops at that river, and just before the war ended in 1945. And Graham Ellison has set up that organization. And we have a group of approximately 10 members, 5 American, 5 Russians, retired military people and retired intelligence people, CIA for our side and CIA equivalent on the Russian side. I'm a senior U.S. guy, and my counterpart, the former Minister of Internal Affairs, is my counterpart. And we have kept a dialogue going for the past 8 years between Russia and the United States. We've met, and we can't meet in the United States, we can't meet in Russia, because neither country will give visas to some of the bad actors on either team. Our intelligence guys can't get visas into Russia, and their intelligence guys can't get visas in the United States. And we meet for 2 days, very intense discussions. We bonded. We can say pretty much what we want to say. Harvard's done a masterful job in terms of establishing that bond, and we develop a statement after every meeting, and those statements reports are passed on to very senior leadership in our respective governments. So I've been involved with that, and I do a lot of pro bono work. Fisher House in San Antonio. I'm a board of visitors, board of directors there. Until recently, on the board of directors of the Armed Services, YMCA. So I'm staying active, but I'm doing, and I do some work for the East-West Institute out of New York. As a matter of fact, next week I'm going to Beijing. This will be my 7th trip on behalf of the East-West Institute. We have high-level dialogue between our group and the Russian or Chinese government officials. We'll meet the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and number 2 guy in the Chinese Communist Party. And we've developed a good relationship and a good dialogue, and that's going very well. So, I don't sit around doing nothing, but I pretty much can figure out what I want to do and what I don't want to do, and it really works out well.
I noticed this star on your lapel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. When I was the president of the San Antonio Water Company, we had the horrific attack on 9/11. All of a sudden it dawned on me that we needed to do something to bring our 1,600 employees together, at least spiritually and intellectually. So I had one of my chief of staff, I only had one chief of staff, go out and come up with some sort of patriotic device that we could give to everybody and everyone could use. So they came back with this star, and we bought a bunch of them, and we put them on cardstock with the appropriate patriotic words about the great United States and will never be deterred. And that's the origin of the star. Mm-hmm. And I get a lot of comments all over. So,
well, Gene, General Habiger, thank you for talking with us this morning, and thank you for what you're doing at the University of Georgia in the United States and around the world. You are a true patriot and public servant, and we thank you for that.
Good. Thank you, Gary. It's been very delightful time with you today, and you're a great moderator.
Thank you.